In the name of the one holy and undivided Trinity, amen. Please have a seat. I just want to give you a note at the beginning of this sermon that there is description in this sermon of an act of violence against a child. And I know that for some folks this can be triggering and disturbing, and I want to make sure this is always true in this church, that you know you have absolute permission to take care of yourselves. You can take a walk around the block for the next 12 minutes. Whatever you need to do is fine. This week was the anniversary of our presidential election. And today we hear about the foolish and the wise bridesmaids, some of whom were ready, and some of whom were caught unaware. From what I hear from therapists in our city, they're treating folks who are exhibiting symptoms of trauma this year, post-election. And from what I hear from my friends who are massage therapists, their business is way up. And what I derive from that is that many people in Seattle were not ready for those results. I think we need to think a little bit on this Sunday. I think we're invited to think a little bit about readiness, about what it means to be ready for something. There's a few things readiness is not. So readiness is not hypervigilance. Hypervigilance is one of the cluster of symptoms that makes up PTSD. It's this enhanced state of sensory awareness that's constantly scanning the environment for signs of danger. And that's an understandable response to trauma. And sometimes it's useful in occasions when you're in a crisis. But when you're in normal life, it's detrimental to relationships, and it actually provides bad data. And it actually makes you less ready for things because it's exhausting. It's an exhausting state to be in. Readiness is also not details. It's not detailed preparations. You can prepare for something in 9,000 ways and still not be quite ready for it, having a baby. You can have the world's most elaborate spreadsheets about the Thanksgiving food and still be completely knocked off course by a surprise guest who you may not enjoy. Readiness is also not numbness. You, like me, might find yourself almost unable to feel anything about the massacre at the First Baptist Church in Sutherland Springs last Sunday, or the murder of an estranged spouse at a church in Fresno. That's overload. I'm not ready for those events. I'm just not capable of being surprised by them anymore. There's something about readiness that is closer to a flow state. That's about having done your work to the peak of your ability, and then also be ready to meet whatever turn or surprise will happen in the course of what you're facing. It's about being able to enjoy the wedding you spent a year planning. And this week, as we had the big mass meeting, Moral Revival, for a new Poor People's Campaign, reinvigorating the work of Martin Luther King at the end of his life, it's about not being slowed down when we're called upon in a long-haul movement, when we are called upon to be in the work to make sure that all people have the basics, right? Clean air, clean water, adequate food, comfortable housing, decent work, good wages. It's about removing the obstacles to doing that work ahead of time so that we're ready to welcome God fully into the world. Today, as we start this descent into darkness and winter, I'm going to talk about 3 kinds of internal readiness. There's a whole host of ways we need to be materially, socially, economically ready. But as we have a moment in this room set apart to sit and think and pray and breathe for a few minutes, I'd like us to think through the kinds of internal housekeeping that allow us to be ready to meet God and do the work. So the first is a kind of intellectual readiness. We know that a lot of the news sites visited by Seattleites last year predicted an easy and overwhelming win for Hillary. So what that tells us now is that those websites and those predictors were missing something critical. And we know now, after this year, that the good data shows us that racial anxiety, not economic anxiety, was the big driver in that presidential election. And for all those times, we, and I'm referring to white people, which is the group that I belong to, and that we, thought, oh, geez, race again. Do I need to be thinking about race again? Haven't we been over this? I'm a good person. I went to a class at my church. I have non-white friends. What more do you want from me? Every time we thought that, we gave ourselves permission to not be ready for that election. Most of my friends who are people of color were not surprised by those results. Aaron, because Aaron works in Grays Harbor County, called it early. My friends in Yakima, not surprised. This means that those of us who weren't ready were missing something critical in how we gathered and assessed information. We were not getting good information about the state of our country. So one of our responsibilities is to stash the oil of good information, wide information, real information. Theological readiness. We need to do our own work now to be ready for the world as it is, so we're not distracted and overwhelmed by our own distress when an event arises that requires our attention and care. In my first real call out of seminary, I used to have to attend these weekly mentoring sessions with my boss that often involved a lot of deconstruction of whatever football game had happened. So I learned to start reading the stuff on the wall across from my chair. And there was a sign directly across from me that I read over and over and over again, that read, "Relax. God is in control." And my boss really believed that. That was core to his belief system. The problem was when events happened that didn't square with that sign, that couldn't be explained by it, he didn't have capacity to interact with it. And so he would offload them to me. In that parish, we had a family that was really right on the edge of being okay, not being okay. The husband was enlisted and gone for long deployments, frazzled mom, several kids, and through a complicated series of events, one day CPS was called on this mom, And instead of being offered the resources that she really needed, which was enough food for her house, some childcare, and probably some counseling, her 6-year-old son was removed from her care, and against all of her warnings to not do this, he was placed with his genetic dad, who was in Idaho. And not long after, that dad beat that child into a coma. And he never woke up. He died. Relax. God's in control. Is an inadequate theological response to that reality. Needless to say, I was the priest appointed to accompany that family through their grief, which I was honored to do. And the reason I could do it was that I had prepared my theology already to account for an event or an evil of this magnitude. I didn't have to sit in shock and throw that family at someone else, because my theology couldn't accommodate that as a reality. We need to store up the oil of theology that it can encounter and hold the world as it is. Vulnerable readiness. This may sound odd, but there is a readiness located in the practice of being together and being known, in the vulnerability of being organized and of pulling together in a common cause. And when we're not ready to do this, we isolate. And isolation comes with a host of consequences, one of the most deadly of which is despair. It's incredibly scary to be with other people and to try to not feel alone. Because when we do that, our flaws will be exposed. At some point, we will be seen behaving badly. We will be wrong about something in front of an audience. We will have to apologize when we do or say something wrong and make amends. We'll have to realize that no one owes us trust after we've messed up. We'll have to learn to build and get disillusioned and recuperate and heal and return and rebuild. We will have to teach others and let them teach us. We will have to learn to forgive our past selves for not knowing everything that we know now. But if there is any worthy work, it is this. If there is any work that readies the world for God, it is this one. The first civil rights movement only worked because it grew within this rich soil of long-established relationships of trust. For decades of people who had been sitting with each other at the hospital, who had made food for each other when someone had a baby, who offered a ride to church to someone who couldn't drive anymore, that huge network of trust held this big dream of God. At the mass meeting last week, Bishop William Barber talked about how in our era, extremists are organized. And he told us that if hate is unified, then love has to be unified. If fear is unified, and it is right now, hope must be unified. If evil is unified, then the good must be unified. We cannot afford to lose each other right now. We need to store up the oil of friendship and prayer and struggle. Let's get ready. God is waiting.